Family, friends, and colleagues, thank you for coming to the defense of my PhD from the ground up. I conducted my research into early Netherlandish paintings as part of the project The Impact of Oil, along with a team of art historians, conservators, and scientific researchers. Esther van Duin was also a project member. Over the past 5 years, the Impact team had the opportunity to visit museums all over Europe. We examined early Netherlandish paintings under the microscope and with non-destructive methods. Using these results, we could compare the technique of different artists or look in depth into the work of a single painter. We captured minute details using digital cameras with macro lenses. Some museums gave us access to conservation files, technical records, or samples, and we also obtained information from published literature. My background and part-time work as a paintings restorer helped me to focus on the technical and physical properties of the works of art. This led me to develop my dissertation topic, From the Ground Up, Surface and Subsurface Effects in 15th and 16th century Netherlandish paintings. The overall aim of the Impact of Oil project was to write a history of the introduction, dissemination, and development of the use of oil media in panel painting from around 1350 to 1550. Although we know that oil was used well before then, it's clear that around that time period, oil as a painting medium was exploited in new ways. Most early Netherlandish painters used paint bound in linseed oil. Some artists modified the properties of their oil by heating it, allowing it to stand in the sun, or adding other materials. When mixed with pigments, some of the properties of the oil medium are the possibility to achieve transparency or translucency, its fluidity, drying, or ability to blend, and the way it can be used to create textural effects. Because of the translucency of the oil medium, light can penetrate to the lower layers of a painting. This means that the layers beneath the surface can have an important visual effect. Each part of the layer structure can have a visual function when an artist exploits the properties of the oil medium. I'll briefly explain how each layer related to my research as we go through the layer structure from the ground up. Most early Netherlandish paintings were built up in a similar way, in a series of layers applied according to an established craft tradition. Of course, individual artists combined and layered their paint in unique ways. In almost all of the paintings we studied, the support was a wood panel. It formed a stable surface onto which the ground was applied, an even white layer made of chalk and animal glue. Some scholars have described how the reflective white ground is the source of the glow in certain early Netherlandish paintings, because light penetrates through translucent layers and bounces off the ground. I question this assumption, as it seems that some artists applied a layer of oil on top of the ground, which would have then turned it a beige color. On top of the ground, the artist then planned his composition by using a wet or dry material to apply an underdrawing. Technical examination methods like infrared reflectography penetrate through the paint layers and allow us to detect the underdrawing, but sometimes it is visible to the naked eye. In this portrait, the mouth and chin were drawn higher than they were painted, and now looks a bit like a mustache. We can assume that the artist didn't intend for the underdrawing to show, but due to his efficient painting technique and the likelihood that the paint has become more transparent over time, it is now visible. I argue that there are cases where the underdrawing may have been intentionally visible. On the right of this detail, you can see hatching and cross-hatching of the underdrawing through the red drapery, and in another painting by the same artist, through a white cloak. Through the examination of the layer structure of the paint, and by making reconstructions, I argue that it's possible that the underdrawing might have been visible immediately after he painted it, and perhaps he wanted it to provide modeling. My argument is strengthened by the fact that visible underdrawing can also be found in paintings by one of his pupils. On top of the underdrawing, some artists applied an intermediate layer, which I define as a paint layer of a single tone, usually semi-translucent, that is applied over the entire surface of the ground before painting begins. I explored some of the assumed functions of intermediate layers by looking at samples and descriptions of paintings that have such layers, and by making reconstructions. Karel van Mander, the famous author of the Schilderboek, described a specific type of flesh-colored intermediate layer called the primeursel. I found primeursel-like layers in paintings made in and around Haarlem, and also in some works by Hieronymus Bosch. In my reconstructions of the primeursel, the flesh color acted as a base tone and made the painting process more efficient. The technique of 15th century painters like Jan van Eyck and Dirk Bouts has been described as being built up from superimposed layers. Within each color area, especially reds and greens, artists applied rather opaque underlayers. Then they applied thin, translucent glazes on top, which allowed the underlayer to contribute to the richness and intensity of the color. Some artists manipulated the glazes and upper layers of the paint to create surface effects. Oil paint could be manipulated by carefully brushing one color into another while the two areas were still wet. The slow drying of the oil medium makes these transitions possible. Some painters exploited wet-in-wet blending when they depicted changeant or shot silk fabrics, which show a subtle transition between two different colors. Other artists did not exploit the translucency and blending properties of oil as effectively. We concluded that they depicted changeant fabrics based on a formula. A brush could also be used to create textural effects in the upper layers, especially to make fabrics appear more realistic. In the top right, there are empasted dots of paint on the surface, and in the bottom right, the artist scraped into the paint. The upper layers of paint could also be manipulated with other tools. Some artists blotted their glazes with a cloth to make them thinner and more even, and this left a pattern of dots on the surface. Jan van Eyck used his hands for the same purpose, and hopefully the small dots that you see on the surface look a bit like palm prints. Here, he touched the paint with his finger. He also scraped into the paint with a blunt instrument. On top of the paint layers, a varnish was sometimes used to saturate the colors and protect the surface. Like the support, this is a layer that I discuss only briefly in my dissertation. An important part of my research involved making reconstructions using historically appropriate materials. Some reconstructions I made were illusionistic, and others were more schematic. In some cases, I compared samples from my reconstructions to those from actual paintings. The cover of my dissertation also shows a reconstruction I made of a painting from the Rijksmuseum by Cornelis Engelbrechts. I hope that this quick introduction has given you a glimpse of some of the subjects I covered in From the Ground Up. My dissertation is made up of an introduction, 6 chapters, a conclusion, and a CD with appendices. Several of the chapters were published as articles in peer-reviewed journals. Others appear only in the printed dissertation. I focused on the techniques of a group of artists, a specific aspect of the layer structure, and surface effects. I would like to thank all of the people and institutions who helped me throughout the project. I'd especially like to thank my primary supervisor, Jan-Piet Philip-Kok, and my patronym and fellow project members, Esther van Duin and Dr. Marjolein Bol. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A word of welcome to you all at this special session of the doctoral board of the University of Amsterdam. And I would like to invite the candidates to read the first part of the formula.
By virtue of the decision of the Rector Magnificus and the doctorate board of this university, I shall, during this hour, in order to obtain a doctorate, publicly defend my thesis, entitled From the Ground Up. All those who wish to raise objections to the contents of the thesis, I request to do so in a just and clear way, which leads to create the opportunity for an orderly exchange of views.
Thank you. In the next hour or 45 minutes, you will be questioned by 6 opponents, and I'm very happy to announce the first opponent to you, who is Professor Dr. Molly Ferries, who is an Emerita Professor in Art History at the Indiana University Bloomington and Emerita Professor in Material and Technical Research in Art History at the Rijksuniversity of Groningen. Please.
Geachte promovenda, esteemed candidate, Abby, I want to say first that I very much enjoyed reading your dissertation. It was very well written, and you have a very lively language with which to describe the painting process. And in my opinion, that might be due to the fact that you have hands-on experience deriving from the making of reconstructions. And I'm very glad to see that kind of argument come into your thesis. Therefore, I'd like to ask you something about your reconstructions, and particularly as they relate to von Mander and his quote about the intermediate layer. We have, of course, very few primary sources for painting technique. It would be very heartening if we could believe what they say. But in fact, I think your research shows that von Mander is, in many respects, hardly credible. In fact, his account is, I think, severely limited, and you've shown that with your research. Nonetheless, you still focused on one feature of von Mander's account, that you went on a quest for the rose or the pink or the flesh-colored intermediate layer. My question is this: what precisely did you learn in your reconstruction studies of white and gray intermediate layers that would have made them less effective in the painting process? That is, not only as a flesh tone, a base for flesh, but also for whole compositions. Because I think you have to go beyond just areas of flesh, because von Mander implies a general function for this layer. But if this layer's effectiveness can only be seen or observed in flesh areas, then von Mander's account becomes even more eccentric. And given the prevalence of gray and white layers, one might assume that the painters from this period considered those layers equally effective. In other words, what I'm asking is, did you notice any serious drawbacks to white or gray layers? Something that would have made them more difficult to work with? Something that would have made them less effective in the painting process than the so-called, the beige rose layer?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and your thought-provoking question. First, I'd like to describe a little bit more about the flesh-colored layer that we're discussing. Karel van Mander, in the Schilderboek, which he wrote in 1604, specifically refers to a primeursel, which is an intermediate layer that is specifically flesh-colored. He mentions it's bound in oil, and that it contains translucent pigments, or it is itself translucent in order to allow the underdrawing to show through. And he also mentions that it could act as a base tone and help simplify the process of painting by giving a tone to begin with. With my reconstructions, I made reconstructions of various types of intermediate layers, beginning with isolation layers that contain no pigment. And the functions of those types of layers could be to prevent the ground from absorbing more oil from the paint itself, so it acts as an isolation. It has a fixing function to fix the underdrawing. Because it's applied on top, it stops more of the underdrawing material from being picked up when the paint layers are applied. White layers and gray layers would have a very similar function. They would fulfill both the fixing function and the isolation function, but with the added benefit of providing a color. Now, applying an oil layer to the ground itself, I was surprised to find that it turned the ground a beige color. We often hear about the glow that comes from within early Netherlandish paintings provided by the bright white ground. But as soon as an oil layer is applied on top, then the color of the ground changes. So one advantage of a white layer, for instance, could be to reestablish the white tone of the ground. And flesh-colored layers, specifically the ones mentioned by Van Mander, could be used as a base tone not only for flesh, but also for other areas of the composition. I mentioned in my dissertation some reconstructions of a painting that I treated in my work as a paintings conservator, a painting from 1530 by Jan Cornelis Vermeijen, in which a flesh-colored layer gave a base tone not only to the flesh, but also to the heavens in the background, to the clothing of the Virgin, and it sort of shined through and provided a warm tone. So I mentioned this warm tone as being quite important, but it also had a bit of a grayish tinge to it. And the primeursel, specifically the flesh color that is mentioned, is often a sort of grayish pink. So I assume that it means that the artists were conscious to begin the painting process with a tone that captured both the warm tints of flesh and the cool tints. And that's how I return to the gray layers. Gray intermediate layers could in fact be an advantage in that they provided the cool tone from the start. And then the flesh tones could be built up in a slightly different way using warmer tones from the start. I think a good example is St. Luke painting the Virgin from the Frans Hals Museum, in which Martin van Heemskerk paints St. Luke with a small panel painting on the easel in front of him. And the painting that he is making, in fact, has a gray intermediate layer, and it's been suggested that the rest of the painting does so as well. So van Heemskerk himself used a gray intermediate layer, and he depicted St. Luke doing the same. I thought that was a very interesting way of showing his technique, but the technique that he used in the painting was in fact slightly different from that on the easel, but that is another story. I'll go back to your interesting question. The advantages of white or gray layers, as I said, could be to establish a different tone from the start, a sort of luminous tone to begin with. I would assume that white not only reestablishes that glow, but might also knock out the beige color of an oil layer that might be applied underneath. And a gray layer, in the same sense, could provide a cool tone, not only for the flesh, but for other parts of the painting. Any drawbacks to the white or gray layer? Perhaps that you'd have to think about how to build up different areas of the paint differently than if you were using a flesh-colored layer. A flesh-colored layer uses a base tone, can really simplify the painting process. In this painting I mentioned by Jan Cornelis Vermeijen, the base tone was left exposed in the midtones of the flesh, and the artist needed only to apply the highlights and the shadows and blend them smoothly with one another to get a very convincing three-dimensional representation of flesh.
Thank you. And I think that we have laid a ground, so to say, for the next opponent, and I'm very happy to announce him, Professor Ron Spronk, who is a professor of art history at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and he holds the special chair called Hieronymus Bos and the Early Netherlandish Painting at Radboud University, Nijmegen, and I welcome him here at this occasion.
Geachte promovenda, esteemed candidate, thank you very much for writing such an eloquent dissertation, and which is also so nicely produced. It was a real pleasure to read it. Your chapter 2 is entitled A Translucent Flesh-Colored Premersal, Intermediate Layers and Visible Underdrawing in Hieronymus Bosch's Paintings. With that title, and with the way you refer to Bosch throughout the text of this chapter, you imply that we are dealing with a homogeneous, coherent oeuvre painted by a single master. This is in contrast with the conclusions offered by Siebesma Ironside in our 1974 dissertation and by Frits Koreny in his 2012 monograph on the drawings. Both authors recognize several different hands and distinguish between drawings and underdrawings executed by a left-handed draftsman, among which is the Rotterdam Peddler, your case study number 1, while others are executed by a right-hander, among which the Berlin St. John at Patmos, your case study number 2. You know these publications since you mentioned them in your footnotes, be it a bit briefly. Could you discuss the findings of these authors in the light of your own observations?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your interesting question. I'd like to mention that since we're still discussing the Premersal, that Karel van Mander in the Schilderboek specifically refers to Bosch as one of the artists who used the Premersal and who used it effectively, in that he allowed the flesh color to contribute to the effect of the picture, but also let his ground shine through. It's interesting that you mentioned the coherence of the oeuvre of Bosch, or the lack thereof. Obviously, there are several different hands, and the underdrawing has been one facet that some authors have researched more deeply in order to attribute the different hands. What's interesting is that the paintings I use as a case study both seem to have Premersal-like layers, but as you mentioned, one of them is attributed to the left-handed Bosch, with hatching often going from the top left to the bottom right, and St. John on Patmos you think more of as the right-handed Bosch from bottom right to top left. Now, what's interesting about my two case studies, the Peddler and the outside of St. John on Patmos, which is known as the pelican feeding her young, surrounded by scenes from the Passion of Christ, is that they are both outsides of wings, as proposed by reconstructions of triptychs that may have existed with paintings from various, that are now spread through various collections that go together. And I thought it was very interesting that both of them seemed to have what resembled a Premersal-like layer, this flesh-colored grayish layer used as a base tone. And in both examples, the underdrawing also shined through, whether it was the left-handed or the right-handed type of underdrawing. In my chapter, I go into further detail about whether or not the artist intentionally intended it to shine through. That is another subject. But in terms of the handedness, I think that's an interesting way of perhaps dividing up Bosch's oeuvre, but I prefer to sort of connect the different parts together. The use of the Premersal in both of these examples, whether it's the right-handed or the left-handed, shows that it may have been a more important part of his technique than we assume. Karel van Mander seems to suggest that he used it everywhere, but the results of technical research, much of which has been done at Museo de Prado, suggested that the intermediate layers that Bosch used are much more varied, that at first he applied an oily layer that did not contain pigments, and then on top he used different colors of underlayers bound in egg very locally, and those could be white or gray or in a few isolated cases sort of orangish pink. But these outsides of wings, the two paintings that I use as case studies, seem to be sort of islands in that storm. So while looking at underdrawing may divide things up, I think looking at the Premersal brings them together.
If Professor Spronk is satisfied with this answer, I can announce your third opponent, and she is Dr. Meeuwissen. She's an assistant professor in art history also at Radboud University and a curator at the Municipal Museum of Alkmaar.
Geachte geachte promovenda. With great pleasure, I have read your thesis from the ground up. Your thesis is well written and illustrated with beautiful details, and it makes clear that restorers look much more carefully, and I may even say, look much better than most art historians. In your very accurate observations, and especially in the reconstructions you've made, lies the greatest value of your dissertation. Your thesis was not intended to give an overview of oil painting techniques in the Netherlands, but instead you have focused on specific aspects of the layer structure. And precisely this approach holds a risk. You have described many aspects of these surface and subsurface effects by different artists over a long period of time, from the middle of the 14th century in Italy until the middle of the 16th century in the northern Netherlands. The result is that your thesis acts as a broad collection of surface and subsurface effects in oil paint in late medieval and early modern times, and that the reader who is in search of the question of which effects occurred where and how, and whether these effects were influenced by each other, is not provided with a clear answer. And here we are faced with the problem that you, as a conservator, are able to observe very carefully, but that we miss the broader art historical context. For example, you choose one post-Eyckian artist from the northern Netherlands, Geertgen tot Sint-Jans, who worked in Haarlem. You describe the surface effects Geertgen makes use of, and you've made beautiful reconstructions, but the art historical questions that come with it are omitted. To be more precise, the surface effect Geertgen uses are, in my opinion, very similar to the surface effects that Rogier van der Weijden uses. In fact, you even place these details almost next to each other on page 121 and 125. I believe these observations to be a bit superficial if you do not address the art historical background. For instance, the assumption that Geertgen was possibly apprenticed to a workshop in the southern Netherlands, in Bruges, where he may have studied the work and especially the surface effects of Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weijden. To conclude, you provide your reader with beautiful and a broad collection of surface and subsurface effects that are brilliantly described and illustrated, but the implications and art historical impact of all of this is slightly missing. Please give me a response.
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your gentle criticism. I will first refer to the fact that restorers see better or look better than art historians. I don't necessarily think that's true, especially with the burgeoning field of technical art history, in which people with a different background become trained to look at paintings in a different way. I think my training as a conservator was extremely valuable in that I'm used to looking at paintings through a microscope. I'm used to looking at paintings as a series of layers, as a three-dimensional object, rather than simply a picture in a book. And that I'm used to using technical examination methods, like infrared, X-rays, looking at things in great detail. So I think that was a very positive side to my research. And in terms of whether, to give a bigger context, whether more art historical information would have given a better context, I must admit that I have not been trained as an art historian. In my undergraduate course, I studied visual arts. I'm trained more as a painter. I went into conservation specifically being interested in Netherlandish painting, but perhaps I do not have the same background in art history that many other people coming to this subject do. So I take your gentle criticism as something that I can build on in my future career. In terms of Geertgen and his influence from artists from the southern Netherlands, that is a very interesting connection. All of the artists that you mentioned, Geertgen tot Sint-Jans, Rogier van der Weijden, Jan van Eyck, use surface effects frequently in their paintings, but use them each slightly differently. For instance, in my article about Jan van Eyck, I described ways in which he scraped into wet paint to make lines or small dashes. I described ways he uses his hands or fingers on the paint surface. And Geertgen also appears to have used a similar scraping technique, to apply texture to his fabrics. And I compared the two of those, perhaps not keeping the question in mind that he may have been directly exposed to the older artist's work. A similar case can be made for Rogier van der Weyden, who treated his paint as a sculptural material. He worked it with his brush. He made ridges of paint that stand up from the paint surface and almost sparkle. He also used blotting, the technique of using a piece of cloth or your fingers to remove a bit of excess paint from the surface. That is also something that Geertgen did. But it's also something that in the larger context of the pre-Eichian and post-Eichian painters that I discussed in the chapter on surface effects in the context of early Netherlandish paintings, it shows that there is a broader picture where these surface effects were used in slightly different ways by a whole body of artists. Now, it seems a little simplified to think that the same surface effects could have popped up in several different regions at several different times. Of course, there was an influence and exchange, artists looking at each other's paintings and seeing perhaps, oh, how did he do that? How did he achieve that surface? Or perhaps more directly, trading tips on how to paint certain things. So that is a very interesting field that I should probably have gone a bit deeper into, but thank you for your comment.
And thank you for your answer. Your next opponent will be Dr. Wadem. He holds the chair in the practice of conservation and restoration at this university. And he has a range of other functions. He's head of conservation at the Statusmuseum for Kunst in Copenhagen and director of the Center of Art Technological Studies and Conservation also in Copenhagen.
Geachte promovenda, esteemed candidate, it has been a real pleasure to read through your dissertation. So much new evidence and new information is surfacing, and indeed thanks to the trained eye that you so eloquently exercises. I would like to dwell a little bit about the question that you just answered, because when you in chapter 3.1 write about surface effects in paintings by Jan van Eyck and describe the blotting and palm prints, you extensively refer to the visual effects on the surface of the glazes and that they were manipulated with either cloth or hands, as you write. You refer to treatises and scholars who have described the phenomena. And it is my impression that your conclusion on this is a rationale in manipulating glazes that would otherwise tend to become either uneven, too thick, or if not blotted, would show visible brushstrokes. This technique was used all over Europe, as you just described, and most frequently in the 15th to the 17th century, like, for instance, also in the medieval German paintings as described by E.A. Schäfer in her Gewebeabdrücke in farbigen Lasuren spätmittelalterliche Tafelmalerei, in Zeitschrift für Kunsttechnologie und Konservierung from 1999. And I touched upon this myself in an article about Dow doesn't paint, oh no, he juggles with his brush, in an article in Art Matters much later, 17th century. But here I suggest that although your rationale seems to be that they were thinning out glazes, I would like to consider whether they really were looking for surface texture, the impression of textile by blotting, so that you would get an even more illusionistic surface. And also consider that light falling on the areas that have been either blotted or touched by the fingers or the palm of your hand would have a different reflection of the light and therefore create images that would have a more differentiated gloss, shadow, diffuse light to enhance the visual effect. Could you dwell a little bit more about this, please?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your interesting question. The effect of blotting on glazes is something that I started looking at very early on in my research, beginning with the Leiden school painters from the 16th century. And it's something that we noticed frequently in paintings from the school of Cornelis Engelbrechts, Lucas van Leyden, and Aertgen van Leyden. And in those cases, you often saw the imprint of a piece of cloth that had been used. And where you saw the imprint often was where the area that had been blotted was overlapping with another area of a different color. And the reasons that artists may have blotted their glazes was that these glazes could be very difficult to handle, sort of gloopy, they showed a lot of brushstrokes, but very importantly, also if they were applied too thickly, they could crack or wrinkle. So one of the very important functions of blotting, in my opinion, is to thin it out and even it out. And that could be done with a cloth, as I said, with the Leiden School, or with a hand, which is something I saw much more in the work of Jan van Eyck, but has also been found in work by other artists. Oil paints, because it's a sort of viscous, tacky medium, it almost calls out to be touched by the painter. I find sometimes when I'm treating a painting as a conservator, I might use my little pinky to sort of blot an area that's a little bit too shiny. So obviously the effect of breaking up the surface a little bit does have an influence on what happens when light strikes it. So that is a very interesting observation, that it perhaps had an intentional effect in that regard. I also think that when you're discussing Jan van Eyck, it's not always large palm prints rolled across the surface, which is what I believe he may have done in the Ghent altarpiece in the large red draperies of God the Father and one of the female donors on the outside of the wing, but that he also used his fingers very locally. And I found it very interesting that I only found those in brown areas, mostly shadows, for instance, in the Washington Annunciation, in the shadow behind the stool. It was used to sort of make a more diffuse shadow. Also in the Arnolfini portrait from London, underneath the dog there is a shadow that's made a bit more diffuse. And on the outside of the Ghent altarpiece, I believe I saw a print that sort of smeared a little bit and made everything a little bit thinner. And I think then the effect of the slightly lighter brown underlayer comes to the front. It's not just a dark brushstroke over a light underlayer, but it's a sort of speckled surface that is a bit more lively. So I believe that you're right in that the effect of light or the effect of the viewer in sort of seeing this slightly speckled surface is very important. In terms, going back to the Leiden School, 16th century painters, I thought the church sermon that's been attributed to Ergen van Leiden was a very interesting example, because both green and red glazes had been blotted. And in the red glazes, there's quite a light-colored underlayer, and the dots on the surface give a very distinctive texture. And seeing that first, I thought, oh, that must be intentional. He couldn't have let that sit there not thinking that the viewer would see it and interpret it as a sort of fuzzy textile. Now I'm not quite so certain, having seen many more examples of blotting and how the fading of red lake glazes can influence how the viewer sees the little bits that are left versus the bits that are thin. I believe that some artists may have exploited that textural effect, but that the primary reason was one of dealing with the materials, dealing with poor handling, dealing with evening out a glaze that was too bumpy, too wrinkled, and that perhaps this texture was a secondary effect that the artist may have liked and lived with.
Thank you. Your next opponent is Professor Wallert, who is the professor who holds the Rijksmuseum Chair in Studio Practices at this university.
Esteemed candidate, it gave me much pleasure to read your dissertation. You convincingly demonstrated your ability to do research on a scientific level. That's of course what any PhD thesis is supposed to be, but you did more. You also convincingly demonstrated the value of bare bones technical art history. Armed with just a camera that anybody could have used and a fairly crummy microscope, you went out and culled new information from paintings. Paintings of which everybody thought they were so extensively studied that any further study would be just a waste of time. But from now on, I look at the red mantle of Joseph in Geertruid's Adoration in a completely different way. I had already understood that there was a red glaze lake over an opaque underlayer, but I and many people with me never really saw the use of that cloth. Thank you for opening my eyes for that. However, your dissertation also gave rise to some questions. On page 36 of your dissertation, you describe a quite peculiar technique. You mention the use of a grain translucent glaze-like paint under a layer of opaque pigments, the reverse layering technique. And indeed, if I look at the paint cross-section, there is a green layer that seems to have the right characteristic of a glaze. Absence of particulate light-scattering pigment material and refractive indices that are close to that of the binding medium. The question is, of course, not so much about the glaze-like character that the paint now has. It's rather about the character that it may have had at the time of application. We all know that upon drying, the original ester bonds of the drying oils undergo hydrolysis, and that the carbonyl groups in the network frequently form complexes with metal cations present in the pigment, producing metal carboxylates. Copper ions released from verdigris, but also azurite and the verdigris, easily create all sorts of coordination complexes or salts in the paint film. Or rather, the pigment, while maintaining its original color, simply dissolves in the medium, thereby assuming the same refractive indices and losing its particulate character. Could it be possible that in this case the underlayer originally consisted of an opaque particulate verdigris that over time has developed in such a translucent copper carboxylate? That brings me to the second part of the question. Has any analysis been done on the brown paints that you show on figures 20, 21 and 22 on pages 38 and 39 in your dissertation? In the discussion you described this as translucent brown initial layer and suggest that it may have had a function in an attempt to depict shot silk. It's a fairly common phenomenon that the copper carboxylate I just mentioned tend to oxidize and discolor in various stages from vivid green to rather dull brown. So then the question presents itself, whether the brown initial layer was in fact an initially brown layer or not. Am I right in assuming that you already answered this question on the next page 40 in your dissertation on the blotting of Engelbrecht's Christ in the House of Mary and Martha and Mary, as shown in figure 24?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your thought-provoking question. I will first start by talking about the green glazes specifically. You very eloquently described the chemistry of why green glazes change, so I will not go much further into detail than that. Only to say that I am aware that layers that appear to be a glaze with no pigment particles in it could have formerly been a particulate layer that has dissolved in the medium, or where the refractive indices of the pigment particles has approached that of the medium so much that it's now translucent. In the cross-section that you mentioned, which I know is one that you yourself took from the painting, to me it seemed clear at least that this translucent layer was a very pure green. It didn't have that appearance of a deteriorated darkened green layer that we might come to associate with one that has been affected tremendously by saponification or dissolving of the medium. And on top of it was a rather opaque layer where particles of verdigris were still quite intact and they themselves hadn't dissolved. I realized that the opaque layer of the verdigris pigment had been mixed with other pigments, which can also affect how or whether that process happens. But I was under the impression that the glaze layer looked quite fresh, if you say. It looked in very good condition. So I'm confident in thinking that in that case that the translucent layer that was below the opaque layer was an intentional layering by the artist Cornelis Engelbrecht, and a very interesting one in my opinion, because we usually expect from early Netherlandish paintings that there will be an opaque layer with a thin glaze on top. And in this case, it seems that on top of a white underlayer, Cornelis Engelbrecht applied a green overall and then sort of tapped in the highlights on top, and that expanded the range of greens or the range of colors that he was able to create. And in the works of Engelbrecht and his pupils, you sometimes see this brown-green color combination. I'll just hold up the picture in case it's, oops, sorry, unclear which figures we're talking about. And as far as I'm aware, no samples have been taken and no analysis has been done of these various colors. I find it interesting that the same brown-green color combination not only appears in the work of Engelbrecht, but in two of his pupils. And looking under magnification with the microscope, I remember seeing brown particles that I can't say definitively looked like earths, but looked more like a brown earth to me than a discolored verdigris glaze. Whereas within the green highlights themselves, there appear to be greenish particles. So I'm fairly convinced that it is meant to be brown-green, but that perhaps some deterioration has happened to make it perhaps more contrasted than it was originally. But these high contrasts seem to fit in well with the color combinations you find in Leiden school paintings. There's often very high contrast between the highlights and the darks in blue draperies, for instance, and I refer to that in my article as the high contrast blue. And I feel like these sort of draperies with two different colors fit well into that model.
Thank you. Your next opponent will be Professor Tennant, who is a professor in conservation science at this university.
Geachte promovenda, like my esteemed colleagues, I too have very much enjoyed reading your dissertation from the ground up, from cover to cover. It was inspiring, intriguing, and in some cases, like my first question, I saw some things that surprised me. Therefore, the question that I wish to put is that you make a short and intriguing statement that the least understood layer in a painting structure is the varnish. I wonder if you'd like to elaborate on that statement.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Perhaps it's the one that's least understood by myself, but I think it's the least understood because often we assume that the varnish isn't there anymore through abrasion over time, through previous conservation treatments, through the fact that these paintings have been hanging for several hundreds of years, that in most cases the varnishes are not there anymore, that they have been unfortunately removed. Unfortunately, also, no analysis has so far been done of a whole-scale look at the use of varnishes in Netherlandish painting or early Netherlandish painting. But what has been done are research projects on English paintings and Norwegian paintings. And the findings from those two research projects seems to suggest that varnishes were indeed used in the 15th and 16th century, and that they were very important. The findings from the English paintings were that these varnishes often contained linseed oil, but also resin or gums or some other components. And the ones from Norway also often contained egg, it was a glare layer, and that sometimes there were touches of paint on top of it. So varnishes were not necessarily a top layer, that it could also be a sort of intermediate layer between paint layers. But if through some act that varnish has been removed, also those very important final touches that the artist made could be removed. I think it would be very beneficial in a future research project to look at varnishes in early Netherlandish paintings, but also because these paintings have been treated in the intervening years, the varnishes we see on the surface are ones that more modern conservators have applied, and I think it might be difficult to isolate the original varnishes that may exist from the ones that have been applied on top.
Thank you very much for that answer. And indeed, if I may pose another, and in a sense you lead me to it, because you mentioned the action of conservators. And I just wonder, since my first question was taken from earlier in your thesis, this is alluded to, but rather briefly and intriguingly, in the latter part of your thesis, and that therefore is through your improved understanding of how underlayers might have functioned, can you give some examples of how a conservator might contemplate dealing differently with such paintings, especially where there are visible intermediate layers?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your second question. Through my work as a conservator, I mentioned earlier that I had treated this painting at the Frans Hals Museum by Jan Cornelis Vermeijen, and that was a very interesting research project, but also made me think differently about how lower layers in a painting can have an effect on the surface. In that case, as I mentioned, the intermediate layer, this flesh-colored intermediate layer, was left exposed to create the midtones in the flesh. And that is a very important visual effect. When a small sample was taken from that area, all that was visible was this intermediate layer at the surface. So someone else could possibly interpret that as the fact that the top layer is missing. There's somehow missing paint on the surface. But by looking at how that blends with the shadows and the highlights, it was obvious that that was something that was intentional. And I hope that my dissertation, if read by conservators, would encourage them to think a little differently about how to retouch an area that seems open. And also related to that is areas with visible underdrawing. I argue in several cases that the artist may have wished for the underdrawing to be visible, or that has become visible over time, but not in a very visually distracting way. In that case, I might also think a bit differently about how far to go in retouching these areas that have visible underdrawing.
Thank you. I may now reintroduce to you Professor Ferries for a consecutive question.
Esteemed candidate, I think I'd like to return to your reconstructions, because really this is part of the methodology that you applied, and I think it's been quite fruitful. I'm wondering specifically if there might have been some way to make them more objective. My question concerns the reflectivity of the ground. This is essential in oil painting. Yet this was not a question that you addressed in a focused way. You mentioned it. You mentioned we don't understand this to the degree that we should. When the ground became colored beige, then the reflectivity lessened in your view. But I wonder, is there any way to measure that? And if you've made all these reconstructions, could you possibly go further and use instruments to determine the various reflectivities in the different layered structures?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your comment and your question. The reconstructions that I made, as I described, some of them were illusionistic, meaning that I tried to copy as faithfully as possible a portion of a painting with some knowledge of the materials that were used, the knowledge of handling, and others were more schematic, non-illusionistic reconstructions where I attempted to use the same, similar materials as had been used in the 15th and 16th century to the best of my ability, but that didn't make a recognizable picture. And the question of whether they could have been more objective, it depends whether one is looking at the illusionistic reconstructions or the more schematic reconstructions. I think both of them taught me a lot about how these lower layers may have functioned. In terms of measuring the reflectivity of the ground, I suppose a colorimeter would help in seeing how much the ground had been toned down. By getting numerical values from that, I suppose you could compare how much the reflectivity had been influenced by different types of layers. Also, infrared reflectography, while we're used to using it for underdrawings, could possibly help in that regard as well. And some of my schematic reconstructions of intermediate layers involved applying these layers on top of and beneath underdrawing. And I think it would be very valuable to look at those reconstructions with infrared techniques and see how closely it resembles what we see on paintings. Now, I admit that because they're thin or thick lines drawn across a panel, it's difficult to compare that to an underdrawing of a painting, but I think nevertheless it might be valuable as well. I also took some samples from the reconstructions that I made and compared them to samples from paintings, but only in a very basic way. Often I didn't have access to the particular samples that I was trying to replicate. They were mentioned in the literature with thicknesses, with materials, with them. It would be very valuable to have those next to each other so I could look at one sample from my reconstruction and then one sample from the painting itself. I think that my reconstructions could be used further by many sorts of researchers. For the moment, they have been naturally aged for 3 years, so perhaps I'll just hang on to them until they've naturally aged further and they can be of use to future research projects.
Thank you for your answer. I conclude that the defense is over, and I will invite you to read the second part of the formula.
Having concluded the defense of my thesis to the best of my ability and pending the decision of the doctorate board, I should like to express my sincere thanks, in particular to my highly esteemed promoter, as well as to those who have so courteously brought forward their objections, and to all who have been so kind to honor this ceremony with their presence.
Thank you. This session is suspended for consultation.